Hello and welcome to the brand new American Reformation podcast. We long to see the wider American Christian church fall more in love with Jesus by learning from the practices of the early church and other eras of discipleship multiplication. We want to hear from you. Make sure you comment and leave a review wherever you're watching or listening to tell us what God is doing in your life or how you feel about today's conversation. Lord, have your way in us. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the American Reformation podcast. Tim Allman here, and I have a college classmate. I don't know, we were maybe not the same year, but a dude that I looked up to at Concordia University, Nebraska. Go Bulldogs back in the day. Big time for, he didn't have the beard. If you're not watching right now, you need to check out YouTube because the beard is on point. But what he did have was a guitar and a voice. In the early contemporary days. You think about contemporary worship arts back in the day, Jason, we were kind of on the front lines of that whole conversation, especially in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod at our Concordias. And I've always looked up to you, man, as a passionate lover of Jesus. I love that you're in our tribe, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and I love what the Lord is doing in your world right now. So just let me share a little bit about who Jason Phelps is. Coaches and disciples fully alive, missional disciple makers to influence the world through his everyday life. He is the discipling director and executive team member at Gloria Day Lutheran Church in Houston, Texas. Gloria Day got to go through the year-long accelerator with Christ Greenfield. We just had so much fun growing with you guys. He's laser focused on catalyzing a movement of disciple making, and as a coach with Disciples Made, an organization out of Kansas City dedicated to seeing 70,000 followers of Jesus, leading 2 million, yes, you heard that right, 2 million friends to live more fully alive by 2040. Talk about a vision for discipleship multiplication. He's uniquely designed to add value to teams and churches through his ability to see the big picture. This is what I've experienced with you. Build bridges, cast vision, and pursue mastery and maximize team efforts. He obsesses over a healthy church culture. We could talk about that a little bit today, and helping leaders live and lead at a life-giving, sustainable pace. So the Sabbath, the rhythms of rest. We love that in the ULC as well. Now, this is where it gets fascinating. He's a husband to Ashley, a gifted actor, musician, teacher, and now NASA engineer. And yeah, you heard that right. And a dad to 3 kids ranging from 8 to 7. What a joy, Jason, to have you on the American Reformation podcast today, bro. Welcome. Thanks for hanging with me.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely thrrolled to be here, and it's good to see you.
Yeah. So tell me, your wife, NASA, what's that? That's awesome.
Right. Yeah. So she was a professional actor when I met her, and then she was teaching preschool to pay the bills, was the school admissions director. And so now we moved over, to Gloria Day a couple years ago, and our church location is across the street from the Space Center. And so she ended up landing a job as a crew provisions engineer, and gets to work with astronauts. And so depending on who you ask, some might say that she's kind of like the astronauts' mom. So anybody, all the astronauts, like anything they want to take to the International Space Station goes through my wife and her team. So
wow. That's spectacular. So thanks for doing this with me today, man. So much fun to talk Jesus with you. How are you praying for Reformation in the American Christian church to get us going today?
Yeah, man, I think my heart burns and yearns to see regular, ordinary people stepping into their personal calling, their unique design, and moving from the temptation of being kind of showing up to church and being a part of church and seeing the staff members provide programs, and you might even say goods and services to the members, and instead of that, moving to I guess what I might call kingdom contributors, that we might all partake in the Great Commission, the priesthood of all believers, saturating our communities, neighborhoods with the gospel and good news of Jesus.
That's huge, man. And we at the ULC, man, we are all about that. as well. So how did you develop your love for discipleship? Especially, I'd love to go back to that kind of origin story, your love for worship arts and how that fanned into flame that love for deep discipleship, that every man, woman, boy, and girl would know and follow Jesus at a deep heart level.
Right. And so I think like for most people who know me, is kind of seeing me in a season right now where I'm not leading worship raises a few eyebrows. Because I mean, especially, when we were, going to Concordia Seward together, whether I was leading praise or praying concerts at Spring Weekend or, whatever it was, playing bars in Lincoln, it definitely raises a few eyebrows. So I have to go back. I guess I'll go back to 2007. And it was my first call in downtown Houston. I was on staff at a church doing worship and youth ministry. And then it was probably a few years after that where we were developing a community within our worship service there, and got invited to partner up with a disciple-making organization, went through a learning community, and we started to kind of develop this culture of family on mission, a culture of intentional disciple making, and so from there, I just kind of, discipleship and worship went hand in hand. 2013, we planted a church, and we were able to kind of put language and vision and values of discipleship and mission at the constitutional and bylaw level, which, gave us just like a very distinct DNA from the get-go. We weren't changing culture. I mean, we were creating it, and it was really a beautiful thing. And so I think what was unique is that, I was the director of worship arts at the church plant, but I was discipling the band. And it was a beautiful thing that, with all the band members, is that my wife and I were kind of co-worship leaders, although she wasn't on staff. She probably should have been. But is that we were inviting these folks into family, the band members who were members of the congregation, and the gigging musicians that we kind of brought in, is that we had a very kind of a vast network of, really of musicians that we could call friends. And, we just invited them into our family. And I think what was unique about kind of our perspective on how we led is that, we kind of recognize that like all Christians, all followers of Jesus are called into the Great Commission. Mm-hmm. And you kind of have this general calling, right? That we're all called to make disciples who make disciples and partner with Jesus in his mission in our everyday lives. And so I saw, my vocation, which you might be able to call like my personal calling as a worship leader, is that, worship leader was really it was the conduit on how I made disciples. And so, did that for 6 years in the church plant. And, we also kind of led a missional community, multiplied missional community. I think about 4 or 5 missional communities came out of ours, and which was awesome. And so I was at the church plant for about 6 years. And by that time, I was leading discipleship kind of taster events and, some training with a national organization, and my love for people and influence, I found a sweet spot in that. And so it's what's really interesting is, after we left the church plant, I kind of had this wilderness season for a couple years. And so I was teaching high school. I was overseeing the chapel band at Lutheran High North. And so I was still involved with worship there. But then, I've been at Gloria Day now for a couple years, and I was called into a position that did not incorporate worship leadership. Now, I think I substitute every once in a while, but I'm not on the worship team. I don't have anything to do with really worship other than my influence and the value that I add. And I'll end with this, is that this is a season, and it's a season that's been kind of hard to step aside from music and worship as a vocation. But what I'm kind of finding is that I always, really over the last 10 years, is putting all my energy and skills into a 1 hour, maybe 2 hour experience on Sundays, I was finding myself unfulfilled with that. And part of that is due to just kind of my philosophy of worship is that, I got to journey with a crew of worship leaders and spouses out of Kansas City with an organization called Love and War. And it was all about moving from a presentational worship leader to an incarnational worship leader. And taking worship on mission. And so everything about that, putting all my eggs in the Sunday basket just left me really unfulfilled. And so now, I get to invest in people, make disciples. And, like you kind of said in my introduction, is that I'm really kind of laser focused on creating and cultivating a discipling culture here at Gloria Day and catalyzing a movement of disciple making to the fourth generation. So, and I've just kind of found that developing people and multiplying leaders is just where I come alive.
Talk about the role. Thanks for sharing your story, bro. Talk about the role of worship in moving by the power of the Spirit in the Word, a follower of Jesus from consumer to contributor, because I think the prevailing model, especially in larger churches with bands, and we got a lot of listeners who may be in a very small, maybe micro church or a church they feel like is declining, and they may say, all we can do is traditional. We don't have anything against contemporary per se, though we should be thoughtful in how it's presented as Lutheran Christians. But it's just the wider, I think this is one of the biggest cases you can make for being wise around how contemporary worship is presented today. It's easier, I would say, in that space to sit and be just a consumer. Wow, the band was good. Man, those guys are really, really on point. And look at Jason, man. He's just so gifted. I don't know if I could be. And that's a consumer. Or I come then, and preachers can fall into this too. And I'm just. Sometimes as a preacher, you're like spinning. It can feel like just spin another sermon, pastor, just do the thing, kind of fill that void in my spirit until next week that I come back. But man, following Jesus is so much more than the hour of power, no matter how powerful that hour is, right? So how do you, again, landing the plane, how do you view worship connected to the consumer to contributor journey?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Tim. There's no doubt about it that, gathered worship is, critical and essential to the bride of Christ, right? And so, that gathering can look differently, whether it's a traditional liturgical context, a contemporary context, a small church, rural church, city church, or if it's just church gathered around a table in a living room, we'll always have the ecclesia, the gathered church. And but I think is that, worship forms us. Mm-hmm. Right? How we worship, what is done in worship. Because, the reality here at Gloria Day, right? We have, I guess probably roughly around 1,000 people on a Sunday between two Sunday services. So, so that is definitely something to steward well and to leverage. And so I think when I look at, regardless of the worship style, is whether it's in a modern liturgy or a traditional liturgy or a home liturgy, is what are we celebrating? What are we highlighting? What are we talking about? What's being shared? Who is doing the sharing, right? Because, maybe in your, in a context is that paid staff and pastors are the people who are, on the platform. And I guess regardless of, kind of understanding of theology with who can do what, I think in any context, you can share stories, right? And so, whether it's, because I think what we celebrate is what will get done. What we celebrate puts on display what we value. What we celebrate publicly forms us. And so how are we sharing stories of life transformation and worship? How are our prayers crafted? Are we praying for breakthrough? Are we praying for multiplication? Are we praying for gospel saturation in our city? Are we praying for the business owners who are followers of Jesus, who have an incredible story of how they're representing Jesus in their workplaces. So I think honestly, like you can take a worship service, and if you can add in stories of discipleship, leadership, mission, multiplication, gospel saturation, all those kind of things, whether it's in a prayer and in a story, man, that is a leg up to be able to utilize our worship gatherings to be able to assist in developing a culture of disciple making and multiplication.
And stories can happen in any size congregation. You may say it's a little bit easier in a smaller church because more people can be known, but in a larger church too, testimonies, the power of testimony, some of them videoed, some of them live, man, it shapes a culture big time, especially toward the end of disciples multiplying disciples. So talk about the journey of moving into disciple making at Gloria Day. Gloria Day is, if you're outside the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, a very, very well respected, long-standing church, many kind of seminal leaders that I look back on the John Kieschnicks and like a lot of people have invested a lot at Gloria Day, and it's not always easy. Dan Shepman, dear friend, man, it's not always easy changing maybe the paradigm model from the sit and get to the get and go right now that is going on at Gloria Day. So how's that journey of disciple making going in such a really historic church like Gloria Day?
Yeah. So thankful for Dan Shepman, our senior pastor and stuff. And because he has been a huge supporter to be able to, he's been super patient. I believe this is his 10th year as senior pastor here. And so, I had a predecessor, Brian Weaver, who was pastor of discipleship here. And I kind of had to pick up where he left off, and he kind of paved the way beautifully. And so I got here, remember my context, I've been in mid-sized congregations and a church plant. And this was my first time in perhaps a larger church. And so I wanted to steward this well. And so I read a couple books because I came on staff summer of 2021. And so I read two books. The first one was Starfish in the Spirit by Lance Ford and Rob Wegner. And I love that book. It's one of my favorites. That's actually how I got connected to Disciples Made, because that book is fruit from Disciples Made's influence. But I knew that book would absolutely blow up Gloria Day. And we did not want to do that. We wanted to be able, our executive team and everything wanted to make sure that we steward this journey well, because my wife, in a very encouraging way, she reminds me that, Jason, that you are an agitator by nature, and by, this vision of building a discipling culture, because, Gloria Day, like you said, you go back to the turn of the century in the early 2000s, we had over 200 ministries, and it was, people, from what I've heard, people called it kind of like the Lutheran Disneyland. And, and that came with some unintended consequences of perhaps staff burnout and all other kind of stuff, right? And so, here I am, this church planter, small, mid-sized congregation guy, to kind of start moving from the consumer to the kingdom contributor to how do we go at a Jesus-paced life? What does it look like to be, to hit the pause button before we go big or go home? What's it look like to pause, to be led by the Spirit, to go deep, and to say, okay, how do we think differently? How do we innovate? How is this helping us to increase our sending capacity of everyday missionaries and leaders into our community? And so kind of taking a lot of that, well, knowing that kind of like, one of the themes is to be able to steward this well is need to embrace both and. Right. And so that led me to a book that I read alongside Starfish in the Spirit called Future Church. Mm-hmm. And Future Church was written by Will Mancini. And that provided something that I thought was just going to fit our culture and our vision beautifully, because what it did is it recognized that like the seeker sensitive, the attractional church was here where you could perhaps make a living, but you kind of lost your life in the busyness and the burnout. Then on the other side, you have the missional kind of movement, house church movement, where you could make a life, but kind of struggle to make a living. So they said, we need to hold both of these. So it's that and, right? And so it was about both engagement and empowerment, about assimilation and multiplication. And I said, that's what we're looking for. And so I led our staff through some training on what that could look like. So that kind of gave us a little bit of a foundation to work on. And then that kind of eventually led us into partnering with Disciples Made, which gave us a system and some programs and courses that were built upon a DNA of intentional disciple-making environments, which came from Starfish and the Spirit. And so overall, as we've been able to steward this, is the question was posed to me is from the founder of Disciples Made is, do you want to go slow or do you want to die? And so which really resonated, with this idea of both. And we don't want to blow up Gloria Day. We want to honor the generations that have been here, since the 1960s. And so, which really, led into Disciples Made really beautifully is that, for me, catalyzing a movement of disciple making to the fourth generation for me last year started with focusing on just a handful of guys. And we had about 16 people in intentional disciple making relationships. And this year, hopefully we're actually multiplying that up to 50 people as we kind of step into the third generation. And so I just know it's patience, intentionality, it's slow. It is in the language also, because language, how we talk about things, the words we use help shape the paradigms, which will shape the culture, which will then help us to fixate and propel the mission. But it's slow. It's slow. Yeah.
I'm proud of you for embracing the slow journey and being as Jesus, because I can imagine there have been moments where you're like, wow, this is hard. and the impatience can kind of settle in, but the Lord has given you a very wise wife and the Holy Spirit, who is a patient comforter for us. And it really, how cool is it to just say, man, Jesus took 3 years with 3 dudes, 12 dudes, and just, he went slow. And that depth of relationship, obviously propelled by the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, is what radically changed the church. They would do whatever it took, cross whatever mountain metaphorically was necessary to accomplish the mission of Jesus. They could not help but proclaim the one who'd called them out of darkness into a marvelous light. And I would love to see nothing more than that happen for every woman and man in our congregations, all of the baptized being released toward that end. So let's talk discipleship, the 5 essential ingredients of an intentional disciple-making environment. I like the IDE. This is the IDE way, intentional disciple-making environment. Knock it out of the park there, Jason. This is fun.
Yeah, I love it. So these were highlighted for me when I read Starfish and the Spirit, and so it brings intentionality. I mean, hence, right, intentional disciple making. And I think why that's key is because it's wrong to say that we haven't been making disciples for hundreds of years, right? But where I think we found church culture is we kind of have found ourselves in what we might call accidental disciple making, non-intentional disciple making, happenstance disciple making, because we have good intentions, we love Jesus, we share our faith, we rub off on one another. But when we talk about catalyzing a movement and raising up kingdom contributors to make a kingdom impact, man, there should be some intentionality. And plus, I mean, honestly, when I got to preach on the parable of the talents a few weeks ago, and man, Jesus wants a good investment or good return on his investment, right?
Facts.
And and there's we want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. And I don't know whether I have a day left, a minute left, 10 years left, or however many years left. And so how do we make the most of our time here? And this idea of intentional disciple-making environment helps us to answer that question. Well, first and foremost, it's what is a disciple? How do you define it? How does your church define it? And if I were to ask you, how do you define what a disciple is? Then I'll ask you, like, well, how do you make one? And I think most people, whether it's a staff person or even, just an ordinary person in our church, right? Like they don't know. So this is the beauty of these 5 ingredients. And I think the best way to describe it is in the image of a table. My friend Craig is also a coach for Disciples Made up in North Texas. And this is the imagery that he uses, is that you have the tabletop. And that tabletop is mission, okay? Which is the first, I'll say the first ingredient here is mission fixated, all right? And that table is held up by 4 legs, 4 essential legs. That first leg is outcome focused. The second leg is habit fueled. The third leg is content flavored. And the fourth leg is community forged, all right? So those 4 legs are necessary to help us fixate on mission, to partner with Jesus in mission, and it's going to help us be intentional. And so I can quickly walk through just kind of what those 4 are. So when we think about outcome focused, right? So that's what our focus is. This is what we are doing. And in particular at Gloria Day and with Disciples Made, is we focus on 2 outcomes. That is growing in our character. That is our being. It's our becoming more like Jesus. And it's exemplified by the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. Love, joy, peace, patience, all the way to self-control. Because those 9 fruit of the Spirit that Paul makes us aware of, really, I mean, that's Jesus's character, right? So we focus on character, and then we also focus on the outcome of personal calling, recognizing that, this is the doing, becoming like Jesus, doing the things of Jesus, right? Like he says in John 14:12, that we will do the things that Jesus did and even greater things, which is absolutely a wild statement. And so, but that's exhibited by the gifts of the Spirit, whether it's First Corinthians, Romans, all of these things. And so we talk about our spiritual gifts, our natural gifts and abilities, the things that we're passionate about. I'm a huge APES fan. Ephesians 4, we call that influencing style, that like for me, like whether it's, kind of like an apostolic shepherd, if you will, that like I can't help but bring that style to the table in any meeting that I have, right? And so we got, gifts of the Spirit, fruits of the Spirit, and we can actually, this is what's cool. So for all the leaders who are listening to this, or, board of elders or board of directors, is that we can actually put metrics to this, because, so often, talk about, this like, okay, we know that like we want to start measuring more than like, butts, bucks, and whatever else, right? And so what's cool is we have this, what we call the my impact equation. And so it's character times calling equals impact. And so as I'm intentionally making disciples, helping them focus on these outcomes of character and calling, that as they grow in character and as they grow in calling, you can multiply those with the self-assessment that we use. And now all of a sudden we can actually have some measurements based upon some self-assessment, just super self-assessments. And so it actually is able to put a really simple number through a really simple self-assessment throughout somebody's intentional disciple-making journey, and actually get some numbers. And what's wild is through, at least through Disciples Made's intentional disciple-making environments, is that we're seeing like over a 500% increase in kingdom impact, and which is absolutely wild. So that's when we talk about, focusing on the outcomes. We're focused on developing, character and calling, becoming more like Jesus, and doing the things that Jesus did.
Dude, so let's pause right there, man. This is so huge. Been a pastor now 15 years. You can't measure discipleship. You observe it. But I mean, to have character times calling equals impact. How is that? So it's a self-assessment. You had me at assessment here too, because competency-based theological education assessment from the student's perspective, as well as a mentor team. All of our students have that sort of a mentor team, and there's an agreed upon number, if you will, around basically that, the character, the being of Christ, as well as the content, the knowing of who Christ is. And sometimes there can be an imbalance, maybe in theological formation around the knowing. No, it's character, but then it is the craft. It is the doing, or like you said, that personal calling. There's a lot of overlap there. So one, praise be to God for Disciples Made. Love it, love it, love it. So good. As well as, I'd like to know more. Are there other people? Obviously there are here, but other people coming alongside on that journey of discipleship assessment? Say more there.
Yeah. So that's actually, what's cool about Disciples Made is that they offer like cohorts, right? And they're structured cohorts, and it brings in content. And then we talk about like these habits to outcomes, all this kind of stuff. And so part of the journey is, the first journey is Followers Made. It's an IDE. And so we have built in at the beginning and like a midpoint at the end, these self-assessments. And so, you take it to get a baseline, and it's not good, bad. It's just a reality of whatever number you get. And most people score super low, and that's okay, because it's about growth, not good or bad, and how good of a Christian you are. And so, so like when you take the My Impact assessment, you answer 10 questions. The first one's going to be about love. Do I love people? How am I doing? Loving people unconditionally. The next one, like, am I experiencing joy on a daily basis? Am I smiling? I mean, it can be a question like that, right? And then another one might be like, am I able to be myself even when I'm around people who aren't following Jesus, right? So more character stuff. And then, and it goes throughout all the list of the fruit of the Spirit. And then what's cool is, some people might make some people uncomfortable, I guess, but like, we're also setting goals. So I know for me, like when I started the journey, and I was leading these dudes, is that I know that sometimes I can be more gentle with my words with my kids when I'm upset, when they're grinding my gears, right? So I set a goal, and I said, I want to grow and be more gentle with my kids. When I start to get upset, can I make sure that I can be firm and I can discipline and love without getting mean in my voice, And so what I started to notice is like what that did, having that goal of allowing the Spirit to develop and awaken that gift of gentleness in me, is that it started to infiltrate my prayer life every day. I was aware of it. I was conscious of it now. And I started this, and that just continues throughout the rest of the journey. And so then you get to the calling stuff. It's a lot of it's about like, am I using my spiritual gifts? Do I know my spiritual gifts? Do I remember them? Am I exercising them? And all that kind of stuff, and just being conscious. Because, I talk to a lot of people too, like, that even other church workers, they may or may not be aware of their spiritual gifts. And if they are they intentionally using them? Because I think this is the next step too, is like, do you allow your spiritual gifts to actually serve as a filter for what you do and don't do? Right? Because like in Ephesians 2:10, we know that we're God's masterpiece and that he designed good works in advance for us to do. So like if God has let's just say a supernatural mission for us, a personal calling for us, and he gave us spiritual gifts and an influencing style in Ephesians 4, chances are all of that like is meant to go together. So like, and so anyhow, like, I love talking about it because, is that to use your spiritual gifts intentionally, what a blessing to the world to be able to find your God-given sweet spot. Because I think you talk about fulfillment, man, there's going to be fulfillment and making a difference in the world. I can only imagine that there'll be a huge difference made and fulfillment all the way around.
Oh, I love this. Love this. Let's talk about spiritual gifts a little bit more and how they're connected to the fruit of the Spirit. I think there's a thread here to pull on. I don't get to choose. Let's just talk fruit of the Spirit. I don't get to choose. Like today, I'm gonna be love, but self-control, patience. Nah, I don't need that. No. Like, it is the fruit of the Spirit. All of these that is the character of Christ. I love how you said that. This is the character of Christ. Now that Christ makes us his dwelling place, if there is one area, I'm struggling with self-control, but maybe joy is there, but I have impulse control or whatever issues, we need to be in discipling relationships around that. And then that discipling relationship, then as we talk character, the character of Christ connected to the fruit of the Spirit, how intimately that is connected to the awakening of the unique gifts. Jason, there are some in our denomination and in some denominations who say we shouldn't even talk about unique gifting at all. And I don't really get that. So what is the rebuttal you make to people who say spiritual gifts, that's what modern day evangelicals kind of focus on? We shouldn't really be talking about that. That puts the onus, this is probably the theology, right? That puts the onus on self rather than on God, and maybe even elevating the ego to say, I have these leadership gifts and I have this apostolic gift. What do you say to someone who wants to challenge even talking about spiritual gifts in that way?
Yeah, well, if I can be honest, I've never had anybody yet challenge that at all. But when you look at least I would just say if I was, it's right there in Scripture, and we know that that 1 Corinthians we have these gifts, and that in Romans these things, and then Ephesians, these roles. And now I understand that sometimes there might be, probably with Ephesians 4, I've encountered differing theologies and thoughts definitely on Ephesians 4. So you kind of take that with a grain of salt. But I think, regardless, is that can we admit that we are the priesthood of all believers, that we've been chosen, that our identity can go back to the Abrahamic covenant, that in Genesis 12, where, is that we are called to be a blessing to the world. And so, and we are called to make disciples. And so if we have these gifts, it's obviously like, you would kind of mention this ego of being built up that like, well, I have these gifts and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, then that's a character issue, right? that you need to work on.
It goes right back. That's right.
If you're having this ego, because I love the acronym that I just read in the book Lead Like Jesus by Ken Blanchard, which was absolutely amazing, and it stands for edging God out. And so just this huge understanding that we are not called to lord over people, but we are called to humble ourselves like Jesus and to be servant leaders, and to make sure we're not edging God out with either pride or fear. That's a kind of a whole separate kind of conversation and stuff. But yeah, so I don't know if you want to follow that up with a question or want to circle back to the two other habits that I'm just super eager to share too.
Yeah, I want to get to the four legs that we're going to get there. But ego, edging God out, man. We gotta write that down, and that is what pride does. That is what sin in its essence does. So good. Let's get into habits. The two key habits. We've got outcome focus. These are the four legs. Habit. We're going to get to content and community. Talk about those two habits, Jason.
Awesome. So the second ingredient. So we got mission fixated, and we've talked about outcome focused. The next one is habit fuel. This is what I love. So when we talk about helping people move from consumers to kingdom contributors, is that we want to help them, become self-feeders and self-leaders, because I think a lot of times, we, with all the best intentions, is that the church culture sets us up that we go to a Bible study to learn. We go to worship, to receive and to gather. And we're always expecting the church to provide these goods and services for us because we don't know how to hear the voice of Jesus, and we don't recognize that we have a personal calling. And so throughout, in an intentional disciple-making journey and environment, is that we want to build spiritual habits. And so, because oftentimes, right, your typical Bible study or small group tends to be focused on the content. So this doesn't this doesn't mean that like because we're focused on the outcomes that we're not focused on Scripture, because that's actually built into the daily habit. So the people that that I'm discipling is like we're reading a chapter of the Bible a day. And that we're also responding, and journaling is the other habit. So we got habit of Bible engagement, hearing the voice of Jesus. And then also we got journaling, which is great because it helps people put the words of Jesus into practice, to start to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd, because like there's like 4 times in John chapter 10 where Jesus says, my sheep know my voice and I'm the Good Shepherd. They know me, right? And so we answer these questions is like we write an I believe and an I will statement, that after I've engaged with Scripture, this is what I believe Jesus is teaching me. And then based on what Jesus is teaching me, I will ... I will do this week. So we're actually putting the words of Jesus into practice, like the man who built the house upon the rock, right? And so now we're actually, this is a great quote. So I oversee men's ministry as well, right? And oftentimes in men's ministry, we talk about iron sharpening iron. Okay, It's all over men's ministry.
Very popular. Yep.
Is that Brian Phipps, founder of Disciples Made, says this. He says, iron sharpening iron shouldn't sound like 2 marshmallows bumping up against each other.
I love that.
A lot of times, like, that's what it could be, is like, you just want to get together and talk and all this kind of stuff. But like when we are hearing the words of Jesus, putting them into practice, right? And so we've perhaps set some calling goals, some character goals. Now we have, we're also developing this habit of peer accountability. And I've been a part of unhealthy accountability groups where there's shame, right? But I love uplifting challenge, where we are affirming, we are cheerleading, we are championing people, and holding them accountable. But it's always from an affirming and uplifting posture out of love. And so, I mean, there's some other habits in there, right? But all of those daily habits are forming us so that as we go in our everyday life, we are now able to stay in step with the Spirit. We are able to pray continuously, because we're also, one of the habits is listening prayer. Allowing Jesus to speak into us, speak over us, remind us of who we are, reveal to us the things he might have for us today. And so now, as disciples are being raised up, being able to hear the voice of Jesus, respond in obedience, engage with Scripture, and they have perhaps like an I will statement, is like, man, we got these self-feeders and self-leaders and kingdom contributors who aren't waiting on staff members like me to put a program together. So that's habit fueled. And the last one, or the last 2, and I'll go through these quickly, is content flavored. So in our disciple making journeys, we do supplement with books, incredible books like Prodigal God from Tim Keller, Hero Maker from Dave Ferguson, and some other books. But those aren't the focus of the journey. Those are all meant to support the outcomes of growing in character and calling. And the last one is community forged, right? We got to do this together. And what's interesting is, I think this also is a differentiator, is that Jesus, I don't see many places in Scripture, if at all, where he's actually intentionally discipling others one-on-one. Not that that's a bad thing, but Jesus, perhaps spent most time with the 12, definitely a lot of intimate time with Peter, James, and John. And he did spend time with the crowds. But when he did, those were always training grounds for his disciples, as well as kind of his apprentices and whatnot. And so here's one other differentiator, and I'll end here, is that discipleship is more about becoming than just about learning. I think oftentimes Bible studies can be about learning more, which then there's an unintended consequence to that the more we learn, and if we're not putting the words of Jesus into practice and we just keep learning, we won't actually experience transformation, because when you start to get into like neurotheology and actually how God wired our brains to change, you need action. to start to rewire our brains and get into the executive functioning, is that you need the action and the obedience portion of it, saying yes to Jesus to actually be transformed. So what ends up happening is you end up having now a bigger and bigger and bigger gap because you're learning more, but you're not changing. And now all of a sudden you're experiencing shame. So that's one thing. And then community is always a byproduct of discipleship. Always. So I think sometimes this is where small groups can get into trouble a little bit, because you start with community. And then if you want to start living life on mission and making disciples and raising up leaders, it's a breach of contract. Because people, that's not what they signed up for. They signed up for community. So if you start with community, sometimes you can, God willing, kind of get disciples. But when you start with disciple making and mission, boy, you're always going to get community, and you're going to get people who are hungry and that kind of thing. So community is always a beautiful byproduct of intentional disciple making.
So beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And disciples made sounds fantastic. Because we got a number of people in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and we can be in our silos, and I hear some of the objections already to such an approach. How do you keep this from becoming discipleship, from becoming legalistic? You do these things, you do these things. And I think that's one of the big complaints from confessing Lutheran Christians is you can't measure discipleship because it's all the work of the Holy Spirit, and even trying to even put any sort of framework maybe even hampers the Spirit, and could lead toward an abuse of respective gifts and et cetera. And I already know the answer to that, but I'd just love to hear your perspective toward the discipleship legalism conversation.
No, absolutely. Because, discipleship, it is the application, right? It ties in with sanctification. First and foremost is that our identity is not earned, right? Saying yes to Jesus and heeding Jesus's words in John 14:15, because he does say, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. Right? So we have to wrestle with that. And I think there is
did he mean it?
You kind of I always end up kind of walking this line with the third use of the law. But I think we always have to remember that our identity as God's sons and daughters is nothing but a free gift of grace. And so when we have words of Jesus, if you love me, you'll obey me, is that all flows from first and foremost our identity that was a gift. And that is an important differentiation to make, is that we do not earn our identity. None of this is about earning. It's all in response to what God has first done for us. And so, when we first recognize that first and foremost, and recognizing that all of this discipleship and obedience to Jesus and saying yes and putting his words into practice flows from our identity and not to earn it.
Yeah, that's so good. Talk about, I think there's a major opportunity for the church right now, because loneliness is an epidemic, that people would move from consumer to contributor, but that community, this deep sense of abiding community as a church goes on mission should be our fuel, our habit fuel, and people checking in on that. I love that. So talk about intimacy and influence instead of approval and control. The church can often, especially, I won't talk synodical stuff here, the Church Missouri Synod, but a lot of it is around approval and control. Just came out of the Synod Convention, right? Rather than intimacy of relationship with God, self, others, and then that respective influence that flows out of that intimacy with Christ. Talk about that, Jason.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, it can even go beyond approval and control, which I'll get to. And so we talk about intimacy and influence. Really, that stems from John 10:10. We got Genesis 1:28, and so for us at Gloria Day, as well as Disciples Made, is all of disciple making is about John 10:10. It's about recognizing that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy this fully alive life. And Jesus said, "I came that you might have life and have it to the full." right? This abundant life. This is not prosperity gospel, right? Because so the question is like, what does it look like to live fully alive in the deepest, darkest parts of your life, or when you've lost it all, that you still have the fruit of the Spirit, that you still are intimately known by God and in that intimate relationship. And then you're still utilizing your gifts and passions and your story to influence the world. And so with Fully Alive, is all of that is really just, it is the big, it is the meat on the bones of disciple making. And so, when we look at Disciples Made's, 2040 mission that you read at the very beginning is to develop, 70,000 disciple makers, and to be able to pour into and invest and disciple and love on 2 million, right, friends who can become fully alive. And so this goes back, right, to Genesis, that we know that Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God. They were fully known, fully loved, no shame whatsoever. They were completely united in perfect union and communion. And so, but we know, right, that was lost. The thief came in and deceived them, and we know that sin entered the world, right? So we have intimacy there. Then we also look at Genesis 1:28, where Adam and Eve were told to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, to subdue it, to govern it, to rule it, to bless it, to steward it. And so we can take from Genesis intimacy and influence, and that's really what it means to be fully alive. Is that you're wholly intimate and you're utilizing your influence to bless the world and to make this world a little bit more like heaven. So we know that the thief comes in and, Adam and Eve, right, and they're kicked out of the garden. Intimacy was lost. Influence was lost. And what ends up happening is when we look at our lives, right, we can see that when we don't know God, when we don't know we're loved by God, when we don't have that intimate relationship, we then kind of like fill our life with like the praise and the adoration from other people. Approval, right? Influence, when we kind of succumb to Satan's lies with that, is that we kind of confuse our influence, or we don't know our calling, is that then that can start to resemble needing control, right? Which also stems from a lack of intimacy or unhealthiness. And so we take these two beautiful things, intimacy and influence, we settle for approval and control. And then here's the next step, though. When Satan, has some power in your life, approval can actually start to seep into to coercion and sex, right? I mean, you look at all this kind of stuff, and it's just like, you look at like, I don't want to say the worst of the worst, right? I mean, because like we're all the worst of sinners and all this kind of stuff, but it can result in that. And then the influence, it can go to control, but then, man, it goes to like power. And so really all this can boil down to like the worst of the world. Like, you talk about like leaders who are far, far, far from Jesus. What do they care about? What do they do? Boy, it's sex and power, right? And all of this stuff is Brian Phipps lays out beautifully in his book, Fully Alive, which he goes into a very in-depth, very readable theological discussion with this whole idea about being fully alive. And the beautiful thing is that Jesus came to restore that for us. And, and so Jesus came to restore the fully alive life. And we know now it's not in its perfection, right? But when he comes again to make all things new, boy, that's when living fully alive will be perfected. So now, as we bless the world, are discipled and start making disciples and stuff, is that we get to live more and more and experience just these glimpses and the beauty of this fully alive life. So.
Yes. Dude, Jason, this has been so much fun. Last question. What's your goal for maximum kingdom impact? God's goal for you, making life on earth. I love how you say this, as it is in heaven. Just riff on this for our closing time. This has been great, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. For me is that I want to walk with Jesus. I want to know Jesus. I want to be with Jesus. I want to be a man, a husband, a father, a friend, a leader, a kingdom contributor myself that just brings depth and a whole lot of love and peace into all my spheres of influence, and just add value to people's life that perhaps some way, somehow, that they're able to experience the love of Jesus through me and my family. I'm still on a journey, even though I talk about this stuff all the time about exploring my personal calling, right? And I hope that there's a time, because I've been leading worship since I was like 14, 15. I was writing songs at 16. I was leading worship at like 5 different youth groups at 5 different churches my senior year of high school. I've released albums, and I've been, as a worship leader for over 20 years. And so, so like, I'm sure there will be another season where I'll step back in to that role in a different context. So kind of like, it's like a big treasure hunt. It's a big expedition, that I know my spiritual gifts. I know my passions. And as I live with intentionality of making disciples and living life on mission, developing and multiplying people, that, I'm taking a stroll through the good works that God has designed for me long before the world was even created. And that's fun. As I go about life, keeping my eyes and ears open. Lord, how can I bless somebody today? And he's got somebody new, somebody old, a new thing to do. And that makes life exciting. And of course, too, is, here at Gloria Day, for the first time in my life and leadership, I want to see, and I'm confident to see, a movement of disciple making take place here in a large prevailing model LCMS congregation that's never been done before, to have 4 generations of disciple makers, just through my simple, small steps of obedience and kind of putting my stake in the ground. So,
dude, you're living that fully alive life right now. Jesus is your head. The joy of the Lord is your strength. And it's a divine adventure that he has called you into, Amen. Jason. And that's the way I feel as well. And I just love, I got so much to learn. Why do I do these podcasts? Because I got a whole lot to learn from amazing leaders like yourself. So I just pray the Lord continues to fan into flame love, joy, peace, all of the fruit of the Spirit in your life, that your sense of that calling connected to a deeper sense of community. I'm happy to be on the sidelines watching you. I'm on the field, but as I look at your life, just on the sidelines, just cheering you on, love and encouraging you, because the work that you're getting after, not just because I focus a lot on leadership, right, and pastoral shortfalls and things like that, but that every woman and man, girl and boy would know their unique calling, centered in their baptismal identity, and that they would go out and love and care for their neighbor. And we can have, what I hear in this conversation today, we can have intention as we do that. And that's a beautiful thing. It doesn't just have to organically happen. No. There can be some intention, but that does require leaders like yourself kind of stepping out and into various contexts like Gloria Day. Just shout out to Dan Shepman and the whole congregation there at Gloria Day. You are a model congregation. I think of Paul referring to a number of different churches, right? I remember the church collective in Houston, as well as the church specific in Gloria Day, with fondness in my heart, and hold you guys up as a real kingdom expanding model right now in this diverse, secular, post-Christian, whatever you want to call it, day and age in which we find ourselves. This has been so much fun. Any closing comments, Jason?
Yeah, man. I mean, for us at Gloria Day, there's so much more to talk about. But, just kind of working with you, so thankful for the Unite Leadership Collective. We were able to journey with you guys to help us bring clarity, which really helped us result in what we call the Gloria Day way, which helps people kind of move from encountering Jesus all the way to be a multiplying disciple maker and kingdom leader and ministry leader and stuff like that. And so, and that was just an absolute joy and a huge help and a tool for us to bring clarity to really kind of to cultivate this movement of disciple making. And so, a huge thank you to you and your team as well, which is just absolutely invaluable to us here in our little corner of Houston.
Praise God, man. And just a little teaser, we're actually, because the accelerator for churches to set aside the amount of time and money we realize is a barrier, especially for a lot of smaller congregations. And so we're actually putting it on Thinkific, an online platform. It's just about ready to be released, very, very inexpensive, so that individuals can go on that journey. And we're here to come alongside them in coaching and the like. But yeah, a lot of video, flipped classroom kind of content ready to come out on that Thinkific platform. So be watching for that. uniteleadership.org to subscribe to our emails. This has been so much fun. If people want to connect with you, Jason, how can they do so?
Yeah, absolutely. JasonPhelps.com. You can type in my name on most social media platforms. Email jphelps@gdlc.org.
This is the one and only Jason PH. Fat. He's fat. Yeah. PH Phelps. PHELPS. This has been so much fun. Sharing is caring. Please like, subscribe, comment wherever it is you take in podcasts. This is the American Reformation Podcast, and we'll continue to have kingdom expanding, multiplying conversations with people within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod as well as those outside of it. Continue to run with the fuel of the Holy Spirit every single day, Jason. I am better because you're my friend. We'll see you next time on American Reformation. Thanks so much, Jason.
Thanks.